morning, everyone. I'm Katie Doherty, the President and CEO of the Kennebec Valley Chamber. And thank you for joining us for our weekly Chamber Connect today, sponsored by Central Maine Power. Today's webinar, we are joined by Andrew Silsby and Greg Garofalo. Andrew is the President and CEO of Kennebec Savings Bank and began his banking career in college as a teller. In the winter of 1993, Andrew transitioned to Kennebec Savings Bank as a loan officer. In just 7 years, he rose to the senior lending position. Time in that position set the stage for his role as treasurer and then chief operating officer. In June of 2014, after more than 20 years with the bank, Andrew took over as president. Craig currently serves as executive vice president at Kennebec Savings Bank, where he is responsible for lending and operations at the bank. Craig began his career at Kennebec Savings Bank in May of 2000, working as a summer teller while on break from Babson College. Upon graduating with his business degree in 2003, he was recruited for the bank's management trainee program. Craig has worked in nearly every area of the bank since then, from the mailroom to lending to branch management, to his current role he serves now. So thank you to Andrew and Craig for taking the time this morning to present and answer some questions from our members. Before we get started, I just wanted to mention this presentation will be recorded and we will be emailing you the link to you later today, as well with the PowerPoint slides. Please put your questions in the chat box and we will have time to answer them in the end. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Andrew and Craig.
Great, thank you. Katie, let's switch over and share my screen. I've got a presentation here for folks to be able to walk us through today and make sure that everybody can see that. Katie, you all set there?
Looks good.
Okay. And we'll change slides here. Okay, so Katie sent out a presentation, an invitation to this presentation, and a couple of comments came in that Craig's taller than me, and in the photos we're the same height, but the truth of the matter is I was standing on a box. Yes, it's true, just for those of you that commented on that. Today's agenda, we're just gonna spend a little bit of time. I'm gonna spend some time talking about the SBA Payroll Protection Program in an overview, give sort of the tenets of the program, and then Craig's gonna dive into the application itself. And then I expect we'll have some questions, and I hope to have some answers for some of those questions, but ultimately we may need to create a parking lot, Katie, for some of those questions to be able to come back to and get some answers for folks. Okay, so, oops, excuse me here. I think this is a disclaimer that basically says we are literally flying a plane at 200 miles an hour while we're building it. And I think that is the truth here. I found this graphic here that basically describes how this has been over the last 45 days. We actually received the president signed the bill into law on a Wednesday night, and then a week later, on Thursday at 7 p.m. at night, we received the rules for us to be able to offer PPP loans through the banking industry at midnight the following day. So we had about 4.5 hours to get ready for this, and it was a little bumpy start, but everybody's worked really hard, and I think that's important to call out. The SBA has done a great job. I think Congress has done a great job. Our own state senator, our own US Senator Susan Collins and her staffer actually helped write this particular section of the legislation, and the banking industry in Maine had a hand in being able to craft some of the language. So hats off to folks that were involved in all of that. I think the important thing here in the disclaimer is that to date, as of Friday night, we have received 48 frequently asked questions and 15 interim final rules. So think about that for a minute. This is an interim final rule, and it's changed 15 times. And so what happens is when you change the rule, you're okay up until the rule change, but then after the rule, you've got to change to the new rule. And it's just been a very difficult process for everybody involved. The SBA has had some challenges. They're waiting for direction from from the Treasury, and all of us are looking for answers as bankers. We want to be able to provide you, our customers, the ability to be able to submit the right information. And so all of us are looking for answers at the same time. What I think is really important is to make sure that we capture your questions. We will put those to the SBA, and they're generally pretty responsive in getting these back. It may take a week or two, but for the most part, the SBA has been able to answer most of our questions over a period of time. So we're going to rely on you for asking really good questions, and some of them we should be able to answer, but others we may need to put in that parking lot, Katie. Okay, so if I can just back up here, I think it's important to go over the tenets of this program. And basically, the CARES Act created the Payroll Protection Program amongst a few other things. In short, municipal, state, and federal governments shut down the economy for public health reasons. And the CARES Act created the Payroll Protection Program, and it was intended to provide up to 2 months of payroll to keep every employee on the payroll and not have them go to unemployment potentially. And in doing that, we ensure that we have a quicker recovery of our economy. And I think all in all, it's a noble effort, and it's doing exactly what we believe it should be doing. It starts out as a loan, and then it's forgivable after you meet certain requirements. So it kind of turns into, a portion of it turns into the grant. It uses the banking industry to deploy, and the reason for doing that is we have a lot of banks across the country. You've got 5,800 banks or so in the United States, and there are a lot of staff members able to deploy this, where I think realistically the SBA would not have the ability to be able to close this many loans so quickly. So folks really understood that this is a delivery system, and they tapped into that delivery system. And ultimately it created a fixed rate in term for this particular loan, and we'll get into that in a little more detail here. A couple other key components here. The maximum loan amount was set at 2.5 times your average monthly payroll, and it would be forgivable if more than 75% or greater was spent on payroll. 25% or less is spent on rent, utilities, and interest on mortgage debt. And the word mortgage has been a question in the SBA world. They do intend to mean collateralized debt is our take of that. It could be a truck loan, but it also could be the mortgage on your building. And SBA has been reasonably forgiving, I think, on that. We'll see how that works out in the forgiveness portion. This question comes up a lot, and the question is, what happens for the portion that isn't forgiven? Well, it turns into a loan. That's the short answer, and it's at a fixed rate of interest of 1%. There are no payments for 6 months, and the loan term is for 2 years total. So it would mean you'd have an amortization period of about 18 months after the 6-month period. So keep that in mind. In theory, you would have had this money, and if you didn't end up spending it all, you would have it to be able to pay the loan back. So it doesn't mean that you couldn't just pay the loan off in full for whatever portion that the SBA doesn't forgive, but you could also pay it over time as it's structured today. Just a couple of numbers here to put this in context for folks. The original CARES Act created just shy of $350 billion for this program. There was a round 2 of funding because it went out so quickly, and they created another $310 billion. That is with a B. So that puts a total of $660 billion available. And we did run out fairly quickly in the first round. Things have slowed quite considerably now. We are only getting an application a day, every couple of days now, where we were getting tons of applications. I mean, I think at some points we were getting 20 and 30 applications an hour. For Kennebec Savings Bank, as of last night, yesterday, we closed 625 loans for just shy of $53 million. And from a payroll standpoint, that basically helps about 6,500 jobs in Central Maine. So we're doing our part, other banks are doing their part, and all in all, I think Maine has fared fairly well. They took down, as of Friday night, 25,615 loans for a total of $2.2 billion. It was interesting to note that I would throw out there that Maine ranked 6th in the country for taking down the largest percentage of its payroll dollars. So we fared really well. My sneaky suspicion is that community banks helped deploy that. We have a very strong community bank network in Maine, and I think they were able to move and be fairly nimble to be able to get that money into play. Nationwide, you're looking at about 4.5 million loans for a total of $511 billion. That does change by the hour, but I would say there's easily still $100 billion available. I'm not convinced at this point they will actually go through all that money. Okay, now that you have your money, what now? That's the question. You have to spend the money over an 8-week period. That was defined in a recently frequently asked questions of 56 days. Craig will talk a little bit more about that in his part of the presentation. You have to spend 75% or greater on payroll expenses, and we'll talk about that. 25% or less can go to rent, utilities, and mortgage debt. You need to maintain accurate records of the money that you have spent. Initially, SBA recommended that you create a separate account to hold that money. We did end up opening a lot of new accounts as a result of that, but they have recently changed their tact on that and are not necessarily requiring that. It is more important that you just maintain accurate records on what you spent the money on. After the 8-week period, from the time, and Craig will go over this in a few minutes, but from the time you received your money, that 56 days have passed, you would complete your forgiveness application. You'll need to provide proof of where you spent the money, and we'll talk all about that, and then submit your application to the lender that provided you the loan in the first place. Our recommendation is that you use the paper application to get your facts and figures set, but then ultimately try to submit your application electronically. I think paper just sort of slows the process down, and most employers, including Kennebec Savings Bank, are working remotely, so paper is more problematic and kind of delays the process for us and for SBA, so electronic is always better. Let's see, most borrowers will fall into 2 groups, and this is my own observation. There's certainly other deviations. I have learned that every business operates differently, but there are really 2 groups of folks that will fall out in this particular program. The first group is people or organizations where their payroll and their number of employees or their full-time equivalents have not changed. So they were the same in 2019 as they are right now, and they will basically spend 75% or more on payroll, 25% or less on rent, utilities, and mortgage debt, and they will be relatively easy to walk through, relative being in air quotes, to be able to go through this particular process. There'll be another group where payroll and FTEs are lower than they were on before February 15th. And that's where you had potentially some layoffs. You had some employees who left because they were scared, or they had underlying health conditions and couldn't work. All of those fall into a category. That particular bucket is going to be a little more complicated. These folks will have to go through the same calculations of the 75 and 25, but the overall forgiveness will be reduced on a percentage basis. And what that basically looks like is if you have payrolls that are 20% less than when they were in 2019 or dates leading up to February 15th, then your overall forgiveness will be reduced by that percentage. SBA is still working on some calculations here, but I think this is going to be a little more complicated for folks, and I think that's where a lot of questions will come into play. And then I'll just remind everybody again, if you do not get all of your loan forgiven, what happens? You have the choice of, it's a loan, and you have a choice of paying it all back. In theory, you would still have that money available because you have not spent it. You could pay the loan off in full, or you could amortize it over the remaining period of time. But I think that's ultimately up to the individual business owner. And we have helped a lot of customers sort of work their way through this. Our goal today is to try to get you prepared. You can't yet actually file this application because the days have not enough days have gone by. So our hope is to try to get you all prepared for what you need to have ready. And there is no rush here. There's quite a bit of time frame that will take place between now and the time that the loan is actually forgiven by the SBA. And Craig will go over that component of that. And Craig, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so I think what Andrew said on April 3rd, what's been interesting, April 3rd was that Thursday night where they gave us the rules, and everybody knew there's $350 billion, and there was a mad rush to grab this money. I think everybody worked hard to get this, and we got the rules on forgiveness on May 15th. So just what's been interesting through this process is now everybody, if you go back to April 3rd, if you knew what you knew on May 15th, you might have looked at this a little bit differently. And we're trying to work through with all of our customers and also our own understanding of what these new rules mean for forgiveness. But because of the rush, everybody had that mentality of, I've got to get to the front of the line. I want this money so I can keep my business going, certainly understandable. But then we got into this issue, well, wait a minute, what did I just do? And now that I understand what the end rules are, okay, let me take another look at this. So on what we're going to walk through is kind of the dates here and what we know as of the moment about the forgiveness process. I think Andrew's analogy of flying a plane at 200 miles an hour, I would add to that the rules of physics and the laws of physics have been changing while we're trying to build this airplane too. So that's certainly been a challenge as we work through this. So when we look through this, and actually if you can jump to the next slide, it'd be great. We just need to think about the forgiveness application. We're going to go through that in a second here. But what's important is, as the borrower, is your date is specific to you. So these started April 3rd. At Kennebec Savings Bank, we closed our first loans on April 8th. So we actually put money in customers' hands on that day. So we've got a group of customers coming up on June 3rd who will be on their 56th day. So that'll be the earliest, at least at Kennebec Savings Bank, that customers are going to have to start or could start submitting these applications. Although now that we've got the ruling, so on the 15th of May, we got the application from the SBA, which was an 11-page document, which we'll give some snippets of in a minute here. But then on Friday, the 22nd of May, they put out two more interim final rulings. One was 26 pages long, and the other one was 19 pages long, that are talking through the specifics of what that application means and how it needs to be completed. The local SBA, to Andrew's point, has done a great job working through this and helping us as lenders and help our customers navigate what that all means. They sent out some notices on this yesterday to us today saying they're still working on their training on what this means for them at the SBA. So Andrew and I are certainly not here to tell you that we know all the answers to all this at this point, but we can tell you what we think we know, and we can tell you what we think you can do to start getting ready for this. So the key is that most borrowers, although I think if you did actually get a loan on the first day, you might be almost at your 56th day now. But for most customers, this is more how can you get prepared and what you should be thinking about as you start working through the forgiveness process. So your 8-week period was 56 days, but with this new guidance that came out and with the application, they've added a little wrinkle to that because a lot of people are challenged by their payroll cycles and what does payroll mean? And they've clarified that now to say, for example, if you're biweekly, you can basically just pick up your next biweekly payroll cycle and use the 8 weeks that start at the next day that you actually pay your employees. So I think that's super helpful for folks who are not trying to figure out how to prorate payrolls based across when their loan dispersed versus when their actual next payroll cycle was. So that's the alternate timeline, but I'm guessing for most people that will become actually the primary timeline. It's just a little bit easier to navigate to say that we took the loan on a Monday, our normal payday was a Thursday, we'll start our 56 days from that Thursday. And that's what the SBA is sort of anticipating, that most folks will kind of take that alternate timeline, although it'll be the primary one. So for if you go back to when you applied for this, customers filled out a pretty simple, when you look at it, it's just a 2-page PDF of this form 2483, where you answered some numbers and then you signed a bunch of certifications to the effect of that you needed this loan and why you needed it. And that application is done and in the past. Now, fast forward today, what they put out on May 15th is the form 3508. I don't know if there's been 100 or 1,000 or so application or forms that have been put out by the SBA since the 8-week period since they've been working on this, but the form now is 3508. I'm sure there's some logic to why those numbers changed, but in any event, this form 3508 is an 11-page document. And at the end of the presentation, there's a link to all these resources so you guys can go find these and look through these. We also have it available on Kennebec Savings Bank's website. But it's an 11-page document that, again, the actual meat of it is relatively simple. It's about a 2-page form. And Andrew, if you can flip to that, I think we're on getting close to the next slide. One more. So this is the form 3508, although it's a control number at the top. But this is the form. And again, the top part of this is going to be relatively straightforward, I think, for folks. You fill in your name, all that stuff, the good information that you would have handy. But then when you get to the next page, Andrew, if you could flip one more, it starts to get fairly complicated in how you're going to do this. And keep in mind what Andrew mentioned, we're learning a lot about how businesses operate. Interesting, on the banking side, payroll is not something that we focus on. We are looking more at income statements and balance sheets, but we've learned a lot about how payroll calculations are done over the last 6 to 8 weeks here. If you've ever taken a loan from us, we never asked you for your payroll records. Well, now we've gotten a crash course in what folks' payroll records look like. Then you've got sole proprietors and independent contractors who don't necessarily have the same information. So in any event, we're looking for some information on here that is relatively complicated. For example, payroll costs. So enter that amount from your PPP Schedule A. And Andrew, if you could flip one more page on this. It's one more after this, or maybe two. Should have driven this part. So this Schedule A worksheet. So that very first line, as you get into kind of the meat of the application, references you to this Schedule A worksheet, which is going to be for a business that has 100 employees, the listing of all 100 of their employees with their employee identifier, which is just the last 4 of their tax ID number. Then their cash compensation, which should be relatively straightforward. But then you get into this full-time equivalent calculation. And this is where Andrew was talking about trying to determine whether you have had a reduction in employees or not. So harken back to when everybody did these applications in early April, you listed on the application what your number of full-time employees were, and you'll be doing a comparison to that number. The rules now are clear as to what a full-time employee means and the way that calculation does. And I'll be a little bit vague here because the details are still a little fuzzy at this point, but effectively they've determined that a 40-hour work week is a full-time employee. So if you did this fast rewind 8 weeks ago and your work week, you counted 30 hours as a full-time equivalent, that now you're going to put that in at a different ratio than you did before. So there's going to need to be some guidance put out here as to how folks will navigate through that piece of the puzzle. But this is where you're going to be doing that calculation on their full-time equivalent and figure out, okay, if I had 100 employees when this started, do I have 100 employees at this point when I'm asking for forgiveness, or how has this changed? And then also the same thing with their salary. So if you have an employee who is getting paid $500 a week, did you change that at all? That is where that calculation is going to get done too. So this is the worksheet that's going to support the beginning of line 1. It gets complicated as well because the other thing, as you recall, as you were doing these applications, this is capped per employee of up to $100,000 in wages. So there are 2 different tables here, one for people whose annualized salary is over $100,000 and one for folks who is under $100,000. So that in and of itself will probably be a lot of work for folks. The interesting, when the federal government puts these forms out, there's a Paperwork Reduction Act that has to estimate the amount of time required to fill these out. This one says 3 hours per application for the customer to complete. What we're trying to do, and what most of the banking industry is trying to do, is to take these and put them into a digital format that becomes more of a workflow where you can walk through and it'll guide you as you're doing this. Because I think if you try to just read this and complete this, you're gonna have a lot more questions than you'll be able to answer by reading the FAQs that are with it. There are also, like I said, 45 pages of documents that came with this 11-page application that are digging into a lot of those specific details around questions here. So as we're thinking about this, and the topic of this is navigating PPP forgiveness, I think it's probably a pretty apt term, is we're going to have to navigate through this, because each customer, Andrew mentioned, we have 625 of these loans just at Kennebec Savings Bank, and there's somewhere north of 4 million of these loans in the country. Each customer is going to spend 3 hours filling this out, and then that's going to come to the bank, and we are going to have to review this. So the timeline, and we don't need to go back to the slide, but the timeline was, we are going to get this application from you at the end of your 8-week period. And once we get it, the banks then have 60 days to complete our review of the application. And then we have to submit that to the SBA. Although in those 2 interim final rulings that came out last Friday, they reference more interim final rulings that have yet to be published. And a good example of that is that we don't have any guidance yet on how we are submitting this to the SBA. So we don't know. So let's just say you give us your application, and we'll get to this in a minute on the supporting documentation that comes with it. We'll have all that information. We'll do our analysis and say, this looks good. And then we don't have any guidance on what we do with it from there. But we do know that once we get it to the SBA, and however way we're going to do that, they then have 90 days to do the review on their end. So there's a pretty long time frame here, from when you submit your application to when forgiveness could potentially be weighed in, on whether you fully qualify or how that's going to look. And I think that's interesting, because when we did this on the front end, we got instant decisions from the SBA. So back to when folks were applying for the loans, when you uploaded something to the SBA, we immediately at the bank side knew that those funds had been reserved and knew it. This will be a little bit different as we work through, okay, now we have it, we send it to the SBA. I'm not sure how that system's going to work to be able to keep folks up to date on where their loan is in that process. One thing they did clarify, though, last Friday, which should help with this, though, is the SBA is going to pay when they do their forgiveness, they will remit payment for the principal as well as the interest through the date that they've completed their review. So if you, for example, had a fully forgivable loan, and as long as we were within that 6-month window, the loan would be completely forgiven plus any accrued interest. So hopefully that will take some of the time pressure off for folks of if this does qualify as you expect it should, there's not going to be any necessarily cost to you for time ticking by. So that rush, and I'm not sure how many folks felt that on the front end, but that rush to get to the front of the line hopefully won't be as strong as we work through this next phase here on the forgiveness. I think everybody's going to certainly want to know, where do I qualify and how did that work? But when we get the final decision from SBA, it's still not clear as to how they'll know. And to their daunting task of looking at 4 million of these loans across the country with pages upon pages of supporting documentation, how are they going to administratively take care of that is a big question. So to that point, I think, Andrew, if you can flip back towards the end of the presentation after the application, I just want to touch on this because I think it's helpful. As you're working through this, and again, as we get more details, we'll be happy to walk through this again, but you do a bunch of certifications again, like you did on the opening application. But then in addition, they are requiring you to submit information. And I just wanted to give you some examples of that. So it says that you have to submit with each 3508 form cash compensation. So you have to have, for example, a payroll form. In addition to either that or a bank statement showing that you've made your salary payments to your employees. You also have to add tax filings for both federal, which would be similar to a Form 941, as well as your state tax filing. And then you have to do anything else for any non-compensation. So if you have retirement or if you have vacation benefits, any of that kind of stuff, you'd have to document that as well. And then any health insurance payments, and like I said, mentioned already, retirement contributions would need to have documentation to support that information. So as we think about that, again, if you're looking at, okay, just the payroll line on this application, depending on your specific business's situation, you can start thinking about what you might be able to gather that will support those. And again, on the application, if you haven't seen it yet, which we'll link to at the end of this, you'll get a chance to read through this and can start kind of gathering that information. So it'll be interesting to see what that is. But then we get that form, we get the 3508, and then for each business, we'll get just on payroll, a half a dozen different forms for that specific supporting documentation to review. Then a similar thing for full-time equivalents, you have to document who you had on the payroll and at that time, and compare it back to what you had in 2019 versus 2020. And there's a lot of specifics there because seasonal businesses are a little different than a business that doesn't have any seasonality to it. And then as Andrew talked about, 75% of this is focused on payroll, while the other 25% is for non-payroll expenses. And you'd have to have documentation. Let's just use something simple like a utility for the cable bill. If you'd have to show that you had that in existence to February 15th, 2020. So you'd have to pull a bill from prior to that, or a contract, or whatever you might have. And then you'd have to show the specific bill for that 8-week period you were doing. And again, with the way these bill, depending on your cable bill, you might get the bill halfway through, or you might get it right at the beginning. Of course, getting those to line up will be challenging. They also give some other examples. If you have a lease, they want a copy of the lease showing that it was in existence prior to February 15, 2020, and then proof of the payments you made on your lease during your 8-week calculation period. So a fair amount of information, a fair amount of stuff there for businesses to gather. Again, stuff that you'll all have, but as you think about going through this, that will be a daunting task all the way across the country to make sure we have that information, we've gathered it, we've reviewed it, taken the time it deserves to make sure everybody gets what needs to happen there. So I think there's just one more page, Andrew, on this. And this is, again, on the application, this is stuff that you should have, but don't necessarily need to submit with the application. So this is, we don't need to go through all these details, but there's other forms that you should keep. And I just wanted to make a note here that they are looking for you to retain this information for 6 years. So I think that's important to understand. And that's 6 years after it's paid in full or forgiven. So the SBA has said they're going to review a bunch of these. One of the interim final rulings came out that all loans north of $2 million, they're going to review them on a one-off basis. And the rest, similar to the way a lot of auditing happens, they'll sample, I'm sure. And exactly what that's going to look like, we don't know. And we also don't really know how there's no way they're going to be able to look at all 4.4 million of these individually. So what kind of delegated authority will we have to make that forgiveness decision is still a little bit up in the air. So that's in a lot of time we have. I've sent on a lot of webinars on this over the last few weeks, and I spent one that was scheduled for 90 minutes just to go line by line through that application, and we made it to like the 6th line in the 90 minutes. So again, that's a very high level cursory overview, but I think what's important is this website. If you go out there, all 15 interim final rulings are there to review. But towards the top of that site, there's a link to the application. And I think that's probably the most important place to start, is just to review the forgiveness application and look at those details. Because again, every business has got a little bit of specificity to it that makes their situation unique. And there are things that certainly, as evidenced by the 15 interim final rulings, were not contemplated when this first came out and continue to evolve as we move through this. So I think I'll pause there and kick it back to Andrew or Katie on that's what we know at the moment.
Craig, I'm sharing the site for SBA and U.S. Treasury on all of the program changes that have happened, but there's good sections, there's good material here for the borrowers and then for the lenders. So this is a great resource link for folks that want to dig in. They can also call us, obviously, and we'll work our way through that. I'm going to flip back here to the presentation. Hang on just a second. and I remain just a little bit concerned on a couple of fronts from your comments, Craig. I believe that the SBA is going to pay the interest on the amount that they forgive. What is not particularly clear, we assume at Kennebec Savings Bank that they will not forgive the interest portion of the dollars that they don't forgive. So if there's $5,000 left over that isn't forgiven, there will be interest accrued on that $5,000, and I am anticipating that they will not pay that, but although we don't have absolute clarification there. The other point I would try to make is, remember in the beginning when we did this application process, I'm going to keep going back, the loan amount is a little bit disconnected with what you're spending the money on. So when we did the calculation, the SBA program set this up to be 2.5 times your monthly average payroll, but yet forgiveness is only 2 times. So effectively, in simple terms, you received a loan amount, a maximum loan amount of 10 weeks of your payroll, and you only have 8 weeks to spend that. So there's 2 extra weeks of payroll that needs to get accounted for by this other rent, utilities, or mortgage interest debt. And there's a little bit of a disconnect there. It was a simple way to create the maximum loan amount, but I think that extra 2 weeks will be a little bit of a challenge. There is, in the interim final rules and FAQs, there is the possibility that you could ultimately, within the 8-week period, pay your employees more than what you paid them in the year prior. And that could take place as hazard pay, and other higher compensation, a bonus potentially. So that's another way to consider. That's a complicated, and we just received some clarification on some of that. So I just want you to understand there's 2 extra weeks here that you're probably not going to be able to spend solely on payroll. And until there's a change in the rules, that's what we're going to have to deal with. I probably wouldn't be rushing to do this forgiveness application. I would probably let a little bit of time go by and let these questions percolate and let the answers come out before you move forward. But that's just a off-the-cuff recommendation. I think that's it, Katie.
Perfect, thank you. We'll transition to questions. So please put questions in your in the chat box. You can either send it to everyone or you can do a private message just to me as well. I did have some questions that got sent ahead of time, so we will go through those as well. One quick comment in the chat was, I was amazed by how quick and easy it was. KSB rocks. So kudos to you and your team, Andrew and Craig. So let's jump into questions. Is there any way to extend the payroll beyond the 56 days?
Great.
Go ahead, Andrew. Yeah, so yeah, no, that I think that alternate schedule I mentioned is the closest thing we've got now, although there is a lot of talk about that being problematic for folks. So back to Andrew's comment on potentially waiting a little bit here to see what happens, I would recommend that, because there's a lot of folks that are struggling with the timing and the cadence of their employees being at work versus the timing of when they took the loan. So I'd say that that's something that they're watching closely.
Okay. Do independent contractors count towards payroll?
1099 employees do not. They qualify on their own. So we probably went through that with borrowers when they were applying, because 1099 employees, folks would ultimately be able to apply for their own loan. So they were not to be included in the payroll numbers, so shouldn't be included on the forgiveness portion.
Where can we find the electronic application for the forgiveness after the 56 days?
So the electronic one, yeah, for Kennebec Savings Bank specifically, we will have that up on our website. We are still, as these rules are going pretty quickly, we're still developing that on our end, but we hope to be able to turn that on by middle of next week is our expectation.
Any guidance for businesses that weren't permitted to open during that time on the payroll side?
I'm not sure I understand the question. So if you weren't able to open, the idea was that you took this money down and you paid your employees, so they would still be on the payroll even though the business wasn't open. So I'm not completely sure I understand what the question would be.
Okay, I can follow up with them on that one. In counting your 56 days, do you begin from the day the funds were deposited into your account?
Yes. So initially it was when the loan closed, but then there were some delays. Most at Kennebec Savings Bank, most of the funds were deposited the same day, although there were some situations where they closed and the documents were returned at 4 o'clock on a Friday and the money didn't go in until Monday morning. So it is the date of disbursement, the day you receive the funds, starts that 8-week period, setting the alternate schedule aside, Craig, which is relatively new.
How do sole proprietors show that their loan was used for payroll? Additionally, can sole proprietors be eligible for forgiveness if they apply for unemployment, especially if retroactive unemployment has not been paid yet due to the system?
So unemployment, we can't really comment on that. At least I can't. I don't know that Andrew knows anymore. That's outside of our purview. But what we've been advising our sole proprietors to do is to make sure that they are writing themselves a defined check during their forgiveness period here, so that there's good paper trail as to, if they have a $8,000 loan, make sure you give yourself a check for $1,000 a week, just simple there, so that you have good records of having given those funds to yourself for payroll.
Are we counting FTE for the 8-week time frame only and comparing from 2019, or are we using January 1, 2020 to date?
It depends. So I'm working on what my best cop-out answer is going to be, Katie. I think that's probably the best one I've got, but it seriously does depend, and there is in that application, it walks through all the various ways you can look at that. And again, it comes back to some of the seasonality issues and back to how you did it up front as well.
I would throw in, Katie, one area that I'm a little bit concerned. I know we're supposed to be giving the answers here, but one area that I'm a little bit concerned about is this FTE. So we today have a definition of how to calculate that FTE, that's 40 hours a week. Just give me an example. At Kennebec Savings Bank, anybody who works 36 hours or more at Kennebec Savings Bank is considered full-time. So if I were filling out the application, we didn't, but if I filled out the application on our business, at the application time, I would have said that those employees that were 36 hours are full-time. Now we hyperlink to the forgiveness, and they now have some rules around what that forgiveness, what the full-time equivalent calculation is. So I think there's going to be a little bit of a challenge here where people are going to get 98% of the forgiveness dollars that they were supposed to get because their calculation is off a little bit. It doesn't seem quite right to me that they weren't as clear at the application stage of how important those FTE calculations would be. And now they're giving us clear guidance on what it is, but they're going back to the earlier number. So that remains a little bit of a concern to me, and I'm certain that we will get some clarification from the SBA as we go forward, but I throw that out as a little bit of a caution.
What if someone didn't have staff reduction but aren't using the loan to pay all the wages?
Well, I think go ahead, Craig.
Well, I was going to say, assuming that they are still paying their employees, that is what they're going to be looking at. So did you show us how much you spent on payroll during those 8-week period? So this comes back to some of the question marks about the certification you made, is that the funds from this loan are necessary to support operations due to COVID-19, and that becomes the part. And you've probably seen a lot of this in the media over the last few weeks, where some businesses are struggling with that kind of dilemma, moral dilemma, or I don't know where you necessarily phrase it, but how important were these funds? And it's hard because that really shifted from when this first started. The certification was, were you in business on February 15th? Did you have less than 500 employees? And were you impacted by this? And that's where it started, and then it's kind of morphed as it's gone. But at the end of the day, you're going to say how much did you pay for payroll during that time frame? So if the specific dollar that came from the loan wasn't used for that, there's no tracing the money, I guess, is the short answer to that question. So as long as you're keeping your payroll and paying your employees, that should be fine.
All right. The 100K per year, the 8 weeks capped at the 15,385 on the page 5 of application, is this for the owner only, or does it pertain to employees also?
My understanding is everybody north of $100,000.
Okay. After receiving the PPP, staff members still decided not to work but stay at home to collect from FFCRA. Or if you had a staff member working but had a life-threatening injury that may lead to possible end-of-life decision, both situations are out of the control of the employer. How will this affect the PPP guidelines?
It's a great question, and they're actually in this interim final ruling. I can't remember which one of the two that just came out. They actually address both of those situations, but those situations, and there are specific guidelines you need to follow to show that let's just talk about the folks that would not come back to work. You have to document, and they give you the steps of, okay, we made an offer to the person, and then they, in writing, came back saying, I'm not taking this offer. It goes a little further to say that you then also let your local unemployment place know about that. It seems a little strange. I don't know where that was told you should have done that when that happened. So I'm not sure about that piece of the puzzle, but they address how you as the employer can say, here's where I made the offer, here's where they didn't accept it. And that it makes it so you're not subject to somebody not choosing to come back to work. And that's been a real issue for a lot of businesses with employees who can make the same or more money by not coming back to work. So they did address that.
So if new staff were hired to compensate for former staff not working, but wages are at a base pay since no experience, what happens then for the employer may not meet the 75% rate of payroll?
Yeah, I think it's a good question too. And I think this is where it gets a little tricky, because in theory, then you didn't spend the money. So you should have it and be able to pay it back as the non-forgivable portion. And I think that part gets a little lost sometimes. And so if you didn't pay them as much, in theory, you didn't use the loan. But I know in reality, some folks may have used the loans for other purposes too. So that in a lot of cases, people took these loans assuming that it would be completely forgivable. That might be a scenario where you're going to not be able to have that portion of it forgiven.
I would just add, Katie, that substituting employees is fine. So if you did have people leave and you're not paying them, but you paid new employees, that's okay. The rate of pay might be lower, and I think that's what the question was. So they'll have a little bit of a challenge there, but substituting employees is totally fine.
Perfect. Should we count each full-time salary person as 40 hours? Some organizations have allowed employees to flex time as needed, so their hours have dropped. These employers have required the employees to use their PTO. Sorry, these employees haven't required.
So this comes back to, again, you're paying people less, and so your payroll expense would be a little bit less. So in theory, you would still have that money, and you would be able to pay back the loan for that portion of it, but you would get forgiven for the portion that they did. So let's say they only work 35 hours instead of 40. That extra 5 hours over the 8-week period, you didn't spend and give to the employee, and therefore you would technically still have that in your account. I know that might not be the case at all businesses, but ultimately I think that's the short answer. And then you have a choice of paying those dollars over the remaining life of that particular loan, or you could pay it off in full, whatever isn't forgiven.
A 941 is a quarterly form, so won't that delay the timely submittals for forgiveness?
Yes, that's the short answer, and why we're saying I don't think there's a huge rush here. You, in some cases, need to provide canceled checks, so the check has to clear, so you have to pay your cable bill. that was a month ago, and you got to wait for that canceled check to come through as one of the documents potentially. So I do believe that these loans are going to sit out here for a little bit longer period of time, and a fair amount of borrowers want to get this forgiven as quickly as possible. Based off the feedback we have received, there feels like there's a little bit of a rush here to get it all forgiven as quickly as possible. And I think that's fair. But my sense is clarity, a little bit of time here will probably help with clarity.
And I'll just add to that, Katie, that on page 10 of the application, it specifically says typically Form 941. So that's not something that we are suggesting. That's actually straight from the SBA here. There's also the other piece of this as that FTE counts are as of through June 30th. And I'm getting in an area that I'm not necessarily super comfortable with here, but there is guidance saying that effectively if you got your FTE count back up by June 30th, then you're going to be okay from that portion of the calculation. But it's something that I can't really wrap my head around from a confusion standpoint, because if these folks were laid off, but then you bring them back after the forgiveness period, you weren't paying them. So I don't understand where the payroll portion of that's going to come from. So we're looking for some more guidance on that piece of the puzzle too.
If an employer uses 100% of the loan for payroll, then is 100% potentially forgiven?
I would say yes, with a big asterisk that it has to be done through that 8-week period. If I go back to my earlier comments, you got 10 weeks of payroll, the 56 days of payroll, and you're having to spend that in an 8-week period. So I would say you would have to do bonuses. You would have to have hired more people to be able to make that work. You've got that 25% or that extra 2 weeks that I think is going to be bothersome for some folks.
When calculating the compensation, is it using gross or net wages for each employee?
It's gross, I believe. And one of the interim final rules towards the beginning walks through, I think it's actually interim final rule 1, that walks through exactly where that compensation is, how that's calculated. And again, this is where it gets tricky, Katie, because some people completed these applications before that rule was out. So we've got customers who went off what the guidance was at the time, and we've got to go backtrack. And they're fine because they're grandfathered because that ruling wasn't out yet, but it'll make this tricky as we work through it.
Okay. Can you be more specific on what is considered utilities?
I don't know that I can be. They've given some examples. That might take me a minute to figure out where I read that, though. But I think they've given some. Yeah,
I can write down that person's name and we can follow back up with them.
I would think it would be anything that the PUC regulates. It would be a simple example. So cable and power, and there's probably a legal answer there. I don't necessarily know it, but we can get into that one.
Okay. So just to be sure, we need tax returns. Our company is a C Corp. It often files its tax return later in the year. Sounds like I need to get our CPAs moving.
I don't know. So tax returns, I'm not sure we're going to need. I'm not sure which piece of that.
Yeah.
And actually, Kate, sorry, go ahead.
I know that some applicants turned in their tax returns on the original application, but really we needed payroll records to determine the maximum loan amount, and now we'll need proof that the payroll was paid and the utilities and mortgage debt was paid. So I don't think the 941 is a payroll tax form, but that wouldn't be your full tax return. So I think there's an assumption there that we need them. That's not something that we're thinking we need to require.
And Katie, just circling back on that question, I knew I read this. So the business utility payments are for the distribution of electricity, gas, water, transportation, telephone, or internet access. So I think those are all pretty straightforward, other than what transportation means. And I knew I'd read that somewhere. I'm not sure what that utility would be. But.
Great, thank you. We do only have about 2 minutes left, so we'll try to go through questions fairly quickly, but we might need to end sooner and follow up on some questions in the end, but can you tell me if 501(c)(6) nonprofits are still not allowed to participate in PPP loans?
You cannot. Katie, we've had lots of conversations because the chamber is...
It's not my question, I swear.
Here's the challenge. From my understanding from Susan Collins' office and others that have worked on this, the 501(c)(6) is a lobbying organization, and there is no desire in Congress to allow lobbyists to be able to get dollars. Now, I know that there's a lot of organizations that are doing good public work, like the Chamber, who are really not doing much lobbying locally, but ultimately it is not allowed. There was a bill that passed the House. It's yet another round of activity that allows chambers of commerce and some 501(c)(6)s to come in, that passed the House, but does not look optimistic that it will pass the Senate. So they may address this again. I know, Katie, you've got your application ready to roll since there's still dollars there, but at the moment that has not changed.
Are there any tax implications on accepting this loan?
I don't think we have guidance on that yet that I've seen.
It was not intended to be taxable. Craig and I are not tax experts, big asterisk there. That's really for the accountants who might even be on the call. But it was intended for it not to, usually a loan that is forgiven is taxable income, but this was not intended to be tax income for organizations.
Is the SBA or bank responsible for the screen who receives these funds? How do we make sure that businesses that really need PPP are receiving it? Who will conduct the audits for over $2 million in funding?
Great question. I don't know that we know the answer to some of that, the audit side of that. I assume that it will be the Treasury that will take care of the $2 million and above loans. We did have a couple of larger loans, but I think it's important to note, Katie, that 72% of the loans that we did at Kennebec Savings Bank were under $50,000, and 56% were under $40,000. Our smallest loan was $400. Our largest loan was $4 million, and that loan paid back off because of the audit requirement. So they were a public company and decided that it wasn't worth it, and they put the money back. So we've had both ends of the spectrum in this particular, but even the $400 loan's got to go through forgiveness.
Clarification from the previous question before about when they mentioned that they weren't able to open. Our business could not open forward-facing operations due to the state mandate. Is the SBA considering any provisions for loan forgiveness based on these circumstances?
I think that's kind of back to the question about, you know, the time frame. So yeah, the short answer is yes, that is definitely swirling. How much they're actually considering it and whether it'll happen, I don't know. But like Andrew said a couple times, I think I would stand by and watch a little bit here to see what happens, because there are folks who, you know, in addition to seasonality, also if just like a restaurant, for example, might have not been able to have anybody there. So yeah, stay tuned.
Maine is obviously a tourist state, and there are a lot of organizations, particularly some of my peers at other institutions, who have a lion's share of their customer base are based off tourism. And there's a lot of questions still swirling over being able to change this time period. I believe there is yet another bill in the House of Representatives, the U.S. House, that addresses and extends this time period to be able to catch more seasonal employees, because this whole thing sort of happened before seasonal employees were employed. And then now they need to hire those seasonal employees, and they're in the period, and there's still a lot of questions. So Craig, I think, is absolutely right. You know, hanging on a little longer here to see how this plays out. There is a lot of interest to try to address that 8-week time period, allow it to either be longer or allow it to start later and end later. But at the moment, that's not what the rules are.
All right, so it is about 5 past. So I'm going to ask one more question and then I'm going to shut it off. There are still a lot of questions in the chat box. I will export the chat box and send over some questions to Craig and Andrew and give us a couple days to get you back some answers if we can, or feel free to email me as well. The last question I'll end with is, if you took less than what you were eligible for, are penalties applied for the total eligible or the total taking?
So again, did you say penalties?
Yeah. If they took less than what they were eligible for, are the penalties applied to the total eligible or the total taken?
I'm not sure that I know the answer to that question, Katie.
Okay.
So let's just hypothetically say you had $100,000 availability and you only took 80,000 for the maximum loan amount. You opted to take less. I think, again, the forgiveness is sort of disconnected. Oddly enough, it's disconnected with the forgiveness portion. So I think if you're able to prove that you spent 75% or more on payroll in the period, then all of it should be forgiven. So there aren't any penalties here. I don't see any penalties. The word penalty doesn't show up in any of there. The only sort of penalty, I think, is just you'll end up not getting that portion forgiven and ultimately have to pay it back over time or pay it in full.
She just commented, by penalty, she means the FTE change.
Oh, yes. Okay. So the FTE, Craig, you didn't spend too much time on that, and I'm not sure we have a lot of time, and it's not overly clear, but the FTE calculation is going to be a little bit tricky. So that I would call it kind of a haircut. Your FTEs may be down by 10%, and therefore you may ultimately only qualify for your maximum amount minus 10% of that.
Okay. Perfect. Well, I think that we will end it there. Thank you to Andrew and Craig for your time today. Great information, and thank you for covering so many questions. I know it's, like you said, it's building a plane at 200 miles per hour. So I think you guys did a great job at answering questions, and we'll follow up with anybody that we didn't get to. Join us next week for our Chamber Connection on Wednesday, June 3rd with the Maine State Chamber Advocacy Team to give us a legislative debrief of where things stand with ending the session so quickly, and what the upcoming session will look like. Keep in mind, we will do a part 2 of PPP forgiveness if we need to as well with SBA, or maybe bring back KSB again as things constantly change. So reach back out to us if you have questions. Please check our website for information and resources for your business, and please let us know if the Kennebec Valley Chamber can do anything for you during this time. Thank you again to our sponsor, CMP. Thank you for joining us this morning, and I hope you have a great rest of the day. Thanks, everyone.